Sarah Martinez had always been the girl nobody noticed. In her small hometown of Cedar Falls, she moved through life like a shadow, collecting whispers and sideways glances that followed her everywhere. The other kids called her Ghost Girl because she seemed to disappear into the background of every room she entered. Teachers forgot her name, classmates overlooked her in group projects, and even her own family sometimes seemed surprised to find her sitting quietly at the dinner table. At 17, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with mousy brown hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail, and clothes that seemed designed to help her blend into wallpaper. Her voice rarely rose above a whisper, and when she did speak, people had to lean in to hear her. The guidance counselor at Cedar Falls High School had already written her off as college material, suggesting instead that she consider vocational training or perhaps a job at the local diner where her aunt worked. Some people are just meant to be background players, Mrs. Henderson had said during their last meeting, not unkindly but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen hundreds of students pass through her office. There's nothing wrong with that, Sarah. The world needs people who can work quietly and follow directions. But Sarah had a secret that nobody in Cedar Falls knew about. Not even her parents, who worked double shifts at the textile factory and barely had energy left to ask about her day. Every night, after finishing her homework and helping with household chores, Sarah would slip into her basement bedroom and transform into someone completely different. She would sit at her second-hand computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as she dove into online forums, coding challenges, and digital puzzles that would have stumped most adults. What had started as curiosity about how computers worked had evolved into something much deeper. Sarah had taught herself programming languages that her school didn't even offer courses for. She could navigate through complex network systems with the ease of someone walking through their own home. She understood encryption, cybersecurity, and digital forensics in ways that would have impressed seasoned professionals in the field. Her online username was Echo Viper, and in the digital world, she was respected, sought after, and anything but invisible. She helped solve coding problems for programmers around the world, contributed to open-source projects, and had even assisted law enforcement agencies with cybercrime investigations, though they never knew the brilliant mind behind the screen belonged to a teenage girl from a forgotten town in rural America. The transformation began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in October. Sarah was sitting in her usual spot in the school cafeteria, a corner table near the kitchen door where the lunch staff came and went, but students rarely ventured. She was picking at her sandwich and reading a computer programming book hidden inside her history textbook, when the commotion started. 3 tables away, Derek Morrison and his crew were making their usual rounds, looking for someone to torment. Derek was everything Sarah wasn't. Tall, confident, popular, and cruel in the casual way that comes naturally to those who have never known real hardship. His father owned the biggest car dealership in town, and Derek never let anyone forget it. "Hey, look who's here," Derek announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "It's Ghost Girl, reading her little book about computers." "What's wrong, Sarah? Can't make friends with real people, so you have to talk to machines?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes down, hoping that if she ignored him, he would move on to easier prey. But Derek was in one of his moods, the kind that meant he wouldn't stop until he had drawn blood. "I'm talking to you, freak," he said, moving closer to her table. His friends flanked him, grinning with the anticipation of a show. "My dad says your parents are probably going to lose their house soon. Factory's been cutting hours, right? Maybe you should spend less time with your computer fantasies and more time looking for a real job." The cafeteria had gone quiet, the way it always did when Derek decided to make someone his target for the day. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what would happen next. Some kids looked uncomfortable, but nobody would speak up. They never did. "You know what?" Derek continued, reaching for her programming book. "Let me see what's so important that you'd rather read this garbage than talk to actual human beings." When his fingers touched the cover of her book, something inside Sarah snapped. Not in an explosive way, but quietly, like the last strand of a rope finally giving way under too much weight. She looked up at Derek for the first time, meeting his eyes directly, and spoke in a voice that was still soft but somehow carried across the entire cafeteria. "You wouldn't understand it," she said simply. "It's about system security and network penetration testing. But I suppose that's beyond someone whose biggest accomplishment is getting his daddy to buy him a Mustang. Derek's face flushed red, and his friends shifted uncomfortably. Nobody talked back to Derek Morrison, especially not Ghost Girl. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded, his voice rising. Sarah stood up slowly, gathering her books. She was still several inches shorter than Derek, but something in her posture had changed. The hunched shoulders were gone, replaced by a straight spine and level gaze. "I said you wouldn't understand," she repeated calmly. "Just like you don't understand that your father's dealership has been running illegal financing schemes for the past 2 years, or that your college application essay was plagiarized from 3 different sources I found in about 30 seconds of searching." The cafeteria was dead silent now. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and Sarah could see real fear creeping into his eyes. Fear and confusion, because the girl standing in front of him was nothing like the timid shadow he had been tormenting for years. "You're lying," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same clinical interest she might show a particularly interesting piece of code. "The essay was about overcoming adversity through leadership," she said quietly. "You took the opening paragraph from a Harvard Business Review article, the middle section from a motivational speaker's blog, and the conclusion from a college prep website. The financing scheme involves inflating trade-in values and manipulating interest rates. Should I keep going?" Derek took a step backward, his face now pale instead of red. His friends were looking at him uncertainly, no longer sure they wanted to be part of whatever was happening. "How could you possibly," he began, then stopped. "Know things?" Sarah finished for him. "It's amazing what you can learn when you actually pay attention. When you're invisible, people say and do things around you that they probably shouldn't. When you understand technology, you can find information that people think is hidden. And when you're underestimated your entire life, you develop skills that nobody expects." She picked up her bag and walked toward the cafeteria exit, leaving Derek standing frozen in the middle of the room. But just before she reached the door, she turned back. "Oh, and Derek?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent space. "That Mustang? Your dad leased it. He didn't buy it. The bank owns it, just like they own the house and the dealership. Maybe you should worry more about your own family's financial problems and less about mine." Sarah walked out of the cafeteria, leaving behind a room full of stunned teenagers and one thoroughly humiliated bully. But more than that, she left behind the girl who had spent 17 years trying to be invisible. That girl was gone forever, replaced by someone who was just beginning to understand her own power. Word of the cafeteria incident spread through Cedar Falls High School like wildfire. But it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Derek Morrison found himself facing a series of increasingly uncomfortable revelations. His plagiarized essay was anonymously reported to the college admissions office. His father received a visit from federal investigators looking into fraudulent financing practices. And Derek himself discovered that someone had hacked into his social media accounts and exposed every cruel message he had ever sent, every picture he had posted to hurt someone else. The school administration launched an investigation, but they couldn't find any evidence linking the incidents to Sarah Martinez. She attended classes as usual, completed her assignments, and spoke only when directly addressed by teachers. But everyone knew. They couldn't prove it, but they knew that the quiet girl in the corner had somehow orchestrated Derek Morrison's spectacular fall from grace. Other students began looking at Sarah differently. Not with fear exactly, but with a new kind of respect. She was no longer invisible, but she wasn't seeking attention either. She had simply revealed a glimpse of who she really was, beneath the carefully constructed facade of mediocrity. It was during this time of shifting dynamics that Sarah first heard about the military recruitment fair coming to their school. She had never given much thought to military service, assuming it was for people like Derek and his friends, the ones who were naturally leaders and comfortable with conflict. But something about the recruitment materials caught her attention, particularly the references to cyber warfare and digital intelligence operations. On the day of the fair, Sarah found herself drawn to a small booth in the corner of the gymnasium, far from the flashy displays of the Army and Navy recruiters who were drawing crowds with their promises of adventure and college money. The booth belonged to a woman in an Air Force uniform who looked to be in her 30s, with short-cropped dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. The woman's name tag read Captain Rodriguez, and she was talking quietly with a handful of students about opportunities in cybersecurity and intelligence analysis. Sarah lingered at the edge of the group, listening as Captain Rodriguez described a world where technical skills and analytical thinking were valued more than physical strength or traditional leadership qualities. When the other students drifted away, Sarah approached the booth hesitantly. "Can I help you?" Captain Rodriguez asked, her voice professional but not unwelcoming. "I was wondering about the cybersecurity programs," Sarah said quietly. "What kind of skills do you need?" Captain Rodriguez studied her for a moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that she was being evaluated in some way. "It depends on what you want to do," the captain replied. "Basic cybersecurity requires understanding of network protocols, encryption methods, vulnerability assessment. More advanced positions might involve digital forensics, penetration testing, or intelligence analysis. Do you have any experience with those areas?" Sarah hesitated. She had extensive experience with all of those areas, but saying so would require admitting to activities that might not be entirely legal, even if they were conducted with good intentions. "Some," she said carefully. "I've done some self-directed learning." Captain Rodriguez smiled for the first time since Sarah had approached the booth. "Self-directed learning is the best kind," she said. "Most of our best people are autodidacts who started young. Tell me, what got you interested in computers?" For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself in the longest conversation she had ever had with an adult outside of her immediate family. Captain Rodriguez asked thoughtful questions about her interests and experience, never once suggesting that a quiet teenage girl from a small town couldn't handle advanced technical work. Instead, she seemed genuinely impressed by Sarah's knowledge and insight. "I think you might be exactly what we're looking for," Captain Rodriguez said finally. "Have you given any thought to what you want to do after high school?" Sarah shrugged. "College, I guess, if I can afford it. Maybe community college first." "There are other options," the captain said carefully. "Options that would let you develop your skills while serving your country and earning money for college. Are you interested in hearing more?" Sarah nodded, and Captain Rodriguez handed her a card with contact information. "Why don't you think about it for a few days? Then give me a call if you want to learn more. There are opportunities available for people with your particular combination of skills and interests." That night, Sarah researched everything she could find about Air Force cybersecurity programs. What she discovered exceeded her wildest expectations. The military wasn't just looking for people who could fix computers or set up networks. They were actively recruiting hackers, puzzle solvers, and digital investigators to fight a new kind of warfare that was happening entirely in cyberspace. She learned about elite units with names like the 16th Air Force and Cyber Command, groups of technical specialists who worked to protect American interests in the digital realm. She read about operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, stopped foreign espionage, and protected critical infrastructure from hostile actors around the world. For the first time in her life, Sarah saw a clear path forward, a way to use her abilities for something meaningful while escaping the suffocating limitations of Cedar Falls. But more than that, she saw a chance to become someone who mattered, someone whose work could make a real difference in the world. The next morning, she called Captain Rodriguez and scheduled a meeting to learn more about enlistment options. It was the first step in a journey that would take her far from the girl everyone called useless toward a destiny that nobody in her small town could have imagined. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in the military entrance processing station in the state capital, taking tests that would determine her eligibility for various career fields. The Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery was supposed to be challenging, designed to identify candidates' strengths and weaknesses across multiple areas of knowledge and skill. Sarah finished the entire test in less than half the allotted time, scoring in the 99th percentile in every category. The testing supervisor, a gruff sergeant who had administered thousands of these exams, stared at her scores in disbelief before asking her to retake several sections to verify the results. When she scored even higher the second time, he made a phone call to someone whose name Sarah didn't catch. "We've got an interesting one here," she heard him say. "Yeah, I'll send the scores up the chain." "No, I've never seen anything quite like this." A week after that, Sarah received a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was polite but formal, asking if she would be available for a meeting with some people who were interested in discussing her career options. They couldn't give her many details over the phone, but they assured her that it was a legitimate opportunity related to her military enlistment process. The meeting took place in a nondescript office building in a city Sarah had never visited before. She was greeted by two people in civilian clothes who introduced themselves only by their first names, David and Maria. They seemed to know everything about her, from her test scores to her online activities under the Echo Viper username, though they gave no indication of how they had made that connection. "We represent a special unit within the Air Force that deals with sensitive cybersecurity matters," David explained. "We're always looking for people with exceptional abilities and the right kind of mindset. Based on your background, we think you might be a good fit for our program." "What kind of program?" Sarah asked. Maria leaned forward slightly. "The kind where your skills would be fully utilized, where you would receive advanced training in areas that most people never even hear about, and where your work would have a direct impact on national security. But it would also mean leaving your old life behind in ways that most military service doesn't require." They couldn't tell her much more without her making a commitment, but they made it clear that she would be entering a world where her current identity as Sarah Martinez would become just one of many faces she might need to wear. She would learn skills that went far beyond what was taught in conventional military cybersecurity training. She would work on operations that officially didn't exist, solving problems that the public would never hear about. "Take some time to think about it," David said as the meeting concluded. "If you decide you're interested, contact Captain Rodriguez. She'll know how to reach us. But remember, once you start down this path, there's no going back to being just another small-town girl with computer skills." Sarah drove home in a daze, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had heard. They were offering her a chance to become something she had never even dreamed of. Not just a soldier or a technician, but a guardian of secrets, a protector operating in the shadows of the digital world. That night, she walked through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, looking at the place that had shaped her for 17 years, the houses where she had grown up, the school where she had been invisible for so long, the faces of people who had never really seen her. In a few months, she would be gone from here forever, transformed into someone whose very existence would be classified information. She thought about Derek Morrison, who had unknowingly set this entire chain of events in motion with his cruelty in the cafeteria. He had no idea that his attempt to humiliate the useless girl had actually awakened something that would take her far beyond anything he could imagine. Sarah Martinez was about to disappear forever, but what would emerge in her place would be something far more dangerous and valuable than anyone in Cedar Falls could have predicted. The girl they had called useless was about to become someone whose capabilities would be legend, whose very name would someday strike fear into the hearts of America's enemies. She just didn't know it yet. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez was officially dead to the world she had known. The girl who had walked across the stage at Cedar Falls High School graduation had vanished into a labyrinth of classified training programs, false identities, and operations that existed only in the darkest corners of military intelligence. Her family received letters postmarked from Keesler Air Force Base, where they believed she was learning basic computer maintenance. They had no idea that their daughter had been selected for something far more extraordinary and dangerous. The training began at a facility that didn't appear on any public maps, nestled deep in the Virginia mountains and protected by security measures that made Fort Knox look like a convenience store. For the first 3 months, Sarah wasn't even allowed to use her real name. She was designated as Trainee 827, one of 12 candidates who had been selected from thousands of potential recruits worldwide. The other trainees came from backgrounds that made Sarah's small-town origins seem almost quaint. There was Chen, a former MIT student who had been expelled for hacking into the university's financial systems to expose corruption. Rodriguez brought street smarts from growing up in gang-controlled neighborhoods and an intuitive understanding of digital surveillance. Jackson had been a child prodigy who earned his master's degree in computer science at 16 before being recruited straight out of graduate school. Despite their diverse backgrounds, they all shared certain characteristics: exceptional intelligence, an aptitude for thinking outside conventional boundaries, and the ability to operate effectively under extreme pressure. What they didn't share was experience with the kind of training they were about to undergo. The program was unlike anything that existed in conventional military education. Physical fitness was important, but mental agility was paramount. They learned not just how to break into computer systems, but how to think like the people who built them, how to anticipate defensive measures that hadn't even been invented yet, and how to operate in digital environments where a single mistake could compromise national security or cost lives. Sarah discovered that her self-taught skills, impressive as they had been, were merely the foundation for capabilities she hadn't known were possible. She learned about quantum encryption methods that were still theoretical to the outside world, about artificial intelligence systems that could wage cyber warfare without human intervention, and about digital weapons that could cripple entire nations without firing a single shot. But the technical training was only part of what made the program unique. They also learned espionage techniques that belonged more in spy novels than military manuals. How to assume false identities so completely that they could fool lie detector tests, how to manipulate people through psychological pressure and social engineering, and how to disappear entirely when operations went wrong. The instructors were a mixture of career military officers, former CIA operatives, and reformed hackers who had chosen to work for the government rather than against it. They were universally brilliant, ruthlessly demanding, and absolutely committed to producing graduates who could operate successfully in any environment, against any adversary. Major Harrison, their primary instructor, had been part of the team that developed some of the military's most classified cyber warfare capabilities. On the first day of training, he addressed the 12 candidates with characteristic bluntness. "Half of you will wash out before Christmas," he announced, his eyes moving from face to face around the room. "Of those who remain, most will spend their careers in support roles, providing technical assistance for operations planned and executed by other people. But one or two of you might have what it takes to become something more. Field operatives capable of conducting solo missions in hostile territory, using nothing but your mind and whatever technology you can carry." He paused, letting that sink in. "Those individuals will become part of a program so classified that its existence is denied by everyone up to and including the President of the United States. They will have capabilities that our enemies can't defend against, because they don't believe such capabilities exist. They will be ghosts in the machine, able to reach into any system, anywhere in the world, and extract what they need or deliver what they must." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This was what she had been training for her entire life without knowing it. Every night spent alone in her basement bedroom, every hour devoted to understanding systems that others took for granted. Every moment of isolation and invisibility in her small town had been preparation for this. The training was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with physical hardship. They were subjected to psychological pressure that would have broken most people, sleep deprivation, impossible deadlines, and scenarios where failure meant the simulated deaths of innocent civilians. They were forced to maintain multiple false identities simultaneously while conducting complex technical operations under surveillance by instructors who were looking for any sign of weakness or inconsistency. 3 candidates washed out in the first month, unable to handle the mental strain. 2 more followed by Thanksgiving, their natural talents insufficient to overcome the demands of the program. By Christmas, only 7 remained, and the survivors had been forged into something harder and sharper than anything their former selves could have imagined. Sarah not only survived the initial training, but excelled in ways that surprised even the instructors. Her ability to maintain emotional control under extreme pressure was exceptional. But more importantly, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of complex systems that went beyond mere technical knowledge. She could see patterns and connections that others missed, finding elegant solutions to problems that seemed impossible. During a simulation exercise in February, she was given the task of infiltrating a heavily defended corporate network to extract specific financial data without leaving any trace of her presence. The target system had been designed by some of the military's best cybersecurity experts, and previous attempts by other trainees had failed within minutes. Sarah approached the problem differently than her predecessors. Instead of trying to find weaknesses in the digital defenses, she spent hours studying the personnel files of the company's employees, looking for human vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She identified a night shift security guard who had accumulated significant gambling debts and a secretary whose daughter needed expensive medical treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the network, Sarah crafted a sophisticated social engineering operation that convinced the security guard to install what he believed was a harmless software update on his workstation. The malware she had hidden in the update gave her access to the building's physical security systems, which she used to create a false emergency that required evacuation of the main server room. While building security was distracted by the fake emergency, Sarah used her access to the security systems to disable surveillance cameras in the executive offices. She then triggered a routine maintenance protocol that temporarily granted elevated network access to administrative staff workstations, giving her the opening she needed to extract the target data without triggering any of the sophisticated intrusion detection systems that had stopped other trainees. The entire operation took 6 hours to plan and 15 minutes to execute. The instructors monitoring the exercise initially thought their surveillance equipment had malfunctioned because they couldn't detect any signs that the network had been compromised. It was only when Sarah submitted the extracted data that they realized she had succeeded where others had failed. Major Harrison reviewed the recordings of her operation with something approaching awe. In 20 years of doing this work, I've never seen anyone combine technical skill with strategic thinking quite like that, he told her during their debriefing session. You didn't just solve the problem, you solved it in a way that demonstrated complete mastery of every aspect of the challenge. Technical, psychological, and operational. That's the kind of thinking that separates good operators from legendary ones. But Sarah's greatest test came during the final phase of training, when the remaining 7 candidates were given their first real-world assignment. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring a terrorist organization that was planning cyber attacks against American infrastructure targets. The group had been careful to use encrypted communications and sophisticated operational security, making it impossible for conventional surveillance to penetrate their operations. The mission was to infiltrate the organization's digital networks, identify their specific targets and timeline, and gather evidence that could be used to disrupt their operations without revealing the source of the intelligence. It was exactly the kind of assignment that field operatives might face in their operational careers, and failure would have real consequences beyond mere training grades. Sarah was assigned to focus on the organization's recruitment and training activities, which were believed to be conducted through encrypted forums and private messaging applications. The challenge was that the terrorists were using multiple layers of security, including custom encryption protocols and communication methods that changed frequently to avoid detection. She spent weeks studying intercepted communications, looking for patterns in language usage, timing, and metadata that might reveal weaknesses in their operational security. Gradually, she began to identify subtle inconsistencies that suggested the organization was not as sophisticated as they appeared to be. While their technical security was impressive, their human security was flawed in ways that created opportunities for infiltration. Sarah created a false identity as a young computer programmer who had been radicalized by recent political events and was looking for ways to strike back against what she perceived as government oppression. She carefully crafted an online presence that would be attractive to terrorist recruiters, social media posts expressing anger and frustration, participation in extremist forums, and demonstrations of technical skills that would be valuable to a cyber warfare operation. It took 2 months of patient work to gain the trust of the organization's recruiters, but eventually they invited her to participate in their training program. This gave her access to their internal communications networks and operational planning documents, information that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional surveillance methods. The intelligence she gathered revealed that the terrorist organization was planning a coordinated attack on power grid control systems in 3 major cities, timed to coincide with a significant political anniversary. They had identified specific vulnerabilities in industrial control systems and developed malware designed to cause cascading failures that could black out millions of homes and businesses. More importantly, Sarah discovered that the organization had been receiving technical assistance from hostile foreign intelligence services, information that revealed a broader conspiracy involving state-sponsored terrorism. The evidence she collected not only allowed authorities to prevent the planned attacks, but also exposed an international network that had been operating undetected for years. When the operation concluded, Major Harrison summoned Sarah to his office for a private meeting. "Congratulations, trainee, 847, he said, using the designation she had carried for nearly a year. "You've just completed one of the most successful penetration operations in the history of this program. The intelligence you gathered has prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack and exposed a threat that we didn't even know existed." He paused, studying her carefully. "But more than that, you've demonstrated capabilities that put you in a very exclusive category. We've decided to recommend you for advancement to Phase 2 training." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Phase 2 was the program that Major Harrison had alluded to on their first day, the one that produced field operatives capable of conducting solo missions in hostile territory. Phase 2 training takes place at a different facility, Harrison continued. "You'll be working with instructors and equipment that represent the absolute cutting edge of cyber warfare capabilities. You'll learn techniques that are so classified that most people in the intelligence community don't even know they exist. And when you graduate, you'll be assigned an operational designation that will become your primary identity for the rest of your career."
He handed her a folder containing her new orders.
"Report to the coordinates in that folder in 2 weeks. From this point forward, Sarah Martinez is a name you'll only use in very specific circumstances. Your operational designation will be Echo Viper 13, and under that identity you'll become one of the most dangerous individuals on the planet." As Sarah left Major Harrison's office, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been invisible in her high school cafeteria had been transformed into something that the people of Cedar Falls could never have imagined. She was no longer the victim of bullies or the overlooked student in the back row of the classroom. She was becoming a weapon, carefully crafted and precisely calibrated for missions that would determine the fate of nations. The training she had completed was only the beginning of her transformation into something that would exist in the shadows of the digital world, striking at America's enemies with capabilities they couldn't defend against because they couldn't believe such capabilities existed. Echo Viper 13 was about to be born, and with her birth would come powers that even Sarah's exceptional imagination had never contemplated. The girl they had once called useless was becoming someone whose very existence would be a closely guarded state secret, whose actions would shape the course of global events from behind a veil of classification and denial. She just didn't know yet that her first real mission would take her back to the world she had left behind, back to people who remembered Sarah Martinez, where she would have to use every skill she had learned to protect a secret that could destroy everything she had worked to become. 3 years had passed since Sarah Martinez had vanished into the classified world of military cyber operations. The woman who emerged from Phase 2 training bore little resemblance to the quiet teenager who had once been invisible in the hallways of Cedar Falls High School. Echo Viper 13 had become exactly what Major Harrison had predicted, one of the most dangerous individuals on the planet, a digital ghost capable of reaching into any system, anywhere in the world. Her operational history was a catalog of missions that officially never happened. She had prevented a nuclear facility meltdown in Eastern Europe by infiltrating terrorist communication networks and feeding false information to their bomb makers. She had exposed a human trafficking ring that operated through encrypted social media platforms, leading to the rescue of hundreds of victims across 3 continents. She had penetrated the digital infrastructure of hostile nations, gathering intelligence that prevented conflicts and saved countless lives. But Echo Viper 13's most impressive characteristic wasn't her technical abilities or her operational successes. It was her complete transformation into someone who could disappear into any environment, assume any identity, and become whoever the mission required her to be. She had learned to speak 7 languages fluently, to alter her appearance and mannerisms so completely that even sophisticated surveillance systems couldn't maintain consistent identification, and to think like the people she was hunting while maintaining her own moral center. The woman who sat in the briefing room at a facility that didn't exist on any official maps looked nothing like the Sarah Martinez who had once lived in Cedar Falls. Her hair was now shoulder-length and auburn, her posture confident and alert. She wore the kind of expensive business attire that would allow her to blend seamlessly into any corporate or government environment. Most importantly, her eyes had changed. They held depths of knowledge and experience that belonged to someone who had seen the darkest corners of human nature and emerged stronger rather than broken. Colonel James Mitchell, her current handler, spread a collection of photographs and documents across the briefing table. Mitchell was a career intelligence officer who had overseen some of the military's most sensitive cyber operations. He was one of perhaps 50 people in the world who knew Echo Viper 13's true identity, and one of even fewer who understood the full scope of her capabilities. "We have a problem," Mitchell began without preamble. "3 weeks ago, someone penetrated the personnel database at the facility where you completed your Phase 1 training. They didn't take anything, didn't leave any obvious traces, but they accessed classified records for several hundred former trainees." Echo Viper 13 studied the documents he had provided, her mind automatically analyzing patterns and implications. Inside job? That's what we thought initially. But our investigation has revealed something more disturbing. The intrusion was conducted using techniques and access methods that match the profile of someone with your level of training, someone who understands our systems intimately because they were trained to understand them. The implications hit her immediately. Another Phase 2 graduate? That's our working theory. We've had 6 operatives complete Phase 2 training over the past 8 years. You're the most recent. The others are currently assigned to deep cover operations in various parts of the world. We've been able to confirm the status and activities of 4 of them. The other 2, Mitchell paused, choosing his words carefully. One of them has been out of contact for 6 months. The other disappeared entirely 2 years ago. Echo Viper 13 felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the briefing room. The idea that one of her fellow operatives had gone rogue was terrifying, not just because of what they might do with their abilities, but because of what they knew about the program and everyone in it. What kind of information was accessed? Real names, family backgrounds, hometown information, psychological profiles? Everything that someone would need to track down our operatives and the people they cared about before they entered the program. Mitchell's expression was grim. "We think someone is building a target list." The conversation continued for another hour, covering operational security protocols, contingency plans, and the various theories about who might be responsible and what they might be planning. But Echo Viper 13 found her attention repeatedly drawn to one particular detail. The intruder had specifically accessed information about trainees from her Phase 1 class. When the briefing concluded, Mitchell handed her a thick folder containing her new assignment. "We need you to investigate this from the inside," he said. "We're going to give you a new identity and insert you into a situation where you can observe and interact with people who might be targets. If someone is planning to use the stolen information against our operatives or their families, you'll be in position to detect and prevent it." Echo Viper 13 opened the folder and felt her world shift on its axis. The assignment was sending her home to Cedar Falls, back to the place where Sarah Martinez had grown up, back to people who had known her before she became someone else entirely. She would be operating under a false identity, but in an environment where someone might recognize her face despite all the changes time and training had wrought. "Is this wise?" she asked, maintaining the professional tone that had become second nature during her operational career. "The risk of exposure seems unnecessarily high." Mitchell nodded. "Under normal circumstances, we would never consider placing you in an environment where you might be recognized. But we have reasons to believe that Cedar Falls specifically is connected to our security breach. Intelligence suggests that someone has been making inquiries about your family, your background, your time in high school. We need to know who and why." The cover story was elegant in its simplicity. Echo Viper 13 would become Drive Alexandra Stevens, a cybersecurity consultant hired by the local school district to evaluate and upgrade their digital infrastructure. The position would give her legitimate reasons to be in Cedar Falls, to interact with people who had known Sarah Martinez, and to investigate any unusual activities or inquiries without raising suspicion. She spent 2 weeks preparing for the assignment, studying surveillance footage of her hometown to see how it had changed, reviewing social media profiles of her former classmates to understand what had happened in their lives, and crafting the Alexandra Stevens identity with painstaking attention to detail. The woman who would arrive in Cedar Falls would be sophisticated, confident, and completely different from the invisible girl who had left 3 years earlier. But despite all her preparation, Echo Viper 13 wasn't ready for the emotional impact of returning to the place where her transformation had begun. As she drove through the familiar streets in a rental car with government plates, she found herself remembering not just the events that had shaped her departure, but the feelings of isolation and powerlessness that had once defined her existence. The Cedar Falls of her return was both exactly the same and subtly different from the town she had left. The same buildings lined Main Street. The same houses sat on the same tree-lined blocks, but there were small changes that spoke to the passage of time. New businesses, fresh paint on old structures, faces that were familiar but marked by 3 years of experience she hadn't shared. Her first stop was the school district administration building, where she met with Superintendent Williams to discuss the cybersecurity assessment project. Williams was an earnest man in his 50s, who clearly viewed the consultation as an important step toward modernizing the district's aging technology infrastructure. "Dr. Stevens, I can't tell you how grateful we are that you're here," he said as they toured the building's server room. "We've been trying to convince the school board that cybersecurity is a serious concern for months, but they don't really understand the risks until someone explains it in terms they can grasp." Echo Viper 13 nodded and made appropriate responses, while her trained eye cataloged every aspect of the district's digital infrastructure. The systems were indeed vulnerable, protected by security measures that would have been adequate 5 years ago, but were hopelessly inadequate against modern threats. But more concerning was evidence that someone had recently accessed the network using administrator privileges that shouldn't have existed. "Has anyone else been working on your systems recently?" she asked casually. "Other consultants, perhaps? Or technical support from your software vendors?" Williams frowned thoughtfully. "Not that I'm aware of, but you'd have to ask Janet Morrison about that. She's our IT coordinator. Actually, you might remember her son Derek if you're from around here originally. He graduated a few years ago." Echo Viper 13 felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Derek Morrison's name, but she maintained the calm, professional demeanor that had become automatic. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Morrison as soon as possible. System access logs will be crucial for understanding your current security posture." The meeting with Janet Morrison took place that afternoon in a cramped office filled with outdated computer manuals and boxes of replacement hardware. Mrs. Morrison was a pleasant woman who clearly took pride in keeping the district's technology functioning despite limited resources and an inadequate budget. "Dr. Stevens, I have to admit that most of this cybersecurity talk is over my head," she said as they reviewed network configuration documents. "I do my best to keep things running and updated, but we're always playing catch-up with newer systems and security requirements." "That's completely understandable," Echo Viper 13 replied. "Most school districts face similar challenges. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any performance issues, unexpected error messages, or requests for system access from people you don't recognize?" Mrs. Morrison hesitated, and Echo Viper 13 sensed that there was something she wasn't immediately willing to share. "Well," she said slowly, "there was something strange about 6 weeks ago. I got a call from someone claiming to be from our student information system vendor. They said they needed administrator access to update security patches, which seemed reasonable since we'd been getting warnings about vulnerabilities." Echo Viper 13 kept her expression neutral, but internally she was already analyzing the implications. "Did you verify their identity? They knew specific details about our system configuration and account numbers. And honestly, they sounded very professional and knowledgeable. But afterward, when I tried to follow up with our regular support contact, they said they hadn't authorized any remote access." Mrs. Morrison looked worried. "You don't think someone unauthorized got into our systems, do you?" "It's possible. Do you remember anything specific about the person who called? Name, accent, technical details they mentioned?" Mrs. Morrison thought for a moment. "It was a woman, probably in her 20s, based on her voice. She had a slight southern accent, I think, and she was very familiar with our network setup. She knew we were running older versions of several programs, and mentioned specific vulnerabilities that I hadn't even heard of." Echo Viper 13 spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing system logs and network traffic data, looking for signs of unauthorized access. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Someone with sophisticated technical skills had indeed penetrated the school district's systems, but they hadn't been interested in student records or financial information. Instead, they had accessed personnel files, specifically looking for information about faculty and staff who had worked at the high school 3 years earlier. They had been looking for information about Sarah Martinez's teachers, her guidance counselor, anyone who might have detailed knowledge of her background and capabilities before she enlisted in the military. Someone was trying to piece together the transformation of an invisible small-town girl into one of the government's most classified assets. That evening, Echo Viper 13 sat in her hotel room, reviewing everything she had learned. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to come together, and the picture they formed was deeply troubling. Someone with insider knowledge of the Phase 2 program was systematically investigating the backgrounds of successful operatives, possibly with the intention of exposing or eliminating them. But more than that, they had specifically targeted her hometown, suggesting that Echo Viper 13 herself might be the primary focus of their investigation. Someone who knew enough about her capabilities to consider her a significant threat was trying to uncover the origins of those capabilities. As she prepared for sleep, Echo Viper 13 found herself thinking about the girl who had once lived in this town, who had suffered the casual cruelty of people like Derek Morrison and the indifference of people like Mrs. Henderson. That girl had dreamed of escape, of finding a place where her abilities would be recognized and valued. She had achieved that dream, but in the process had become someone who existed in a world of shadows and secrets, where success was measured by missions that could never be acknowledged and enemies that could never be named. Now someone was trying to drag her back into the light, to expose the transformation that had taken her from invisible victim to invisible predator. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had returned to Cedar Falls as a cybersecurity expert, but the greatest threat to security was someone who had emerged from the same program that created her. The hunters had become the hunted, and Echo Viper 13 would need every skill she had developed to survive what was coming. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of identifying who was behind the investigation, but tonight she allowed herself a moment of reflection on the journey that had brought her to this point. The girl they had once called useless was now protecting the secret of her own existence, using abilities that her former tormentors couldn't imagine, against an enemy who understood those abilities all too well. The game was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than anyone in Cedar Falls could possibly understand. The investigation began in earnest the next morning when Echo Viper 13 started her systematic examination of everyone who had been part of Sarah Martinez's world 3 years earlier. Operating under the cover of Dr. Alexandra Stevens, she had legitimate reasons to visit the high school, interview staff members, and access records that might contain clues about who was investigating her past. Cedar Falls High School looked smaller than she remembered, but the hallways still carried the familiar mixture of disinfectant, teenage anxiety, and industrial carpet that defined public education environments everywhere. As she walked through the building, supposedly conducting a security assessment of their network infrastructure, Echo Viper 13 found herself remembering the girl who had once moved through these same spaces like a ghost. Her first formal interview was with Mrs. Joan Henderson, the guidance counselor who had dismissed Sarah Martinez's potential so casually 3 years earlier. Henderson was approaching retirement, her office still decorated with the same motivational posters and college brochures that had failed to inspire Sarah during their last conversation. Dr. Stevens, I'm not sure how much help I can be with cybersecurity matters, Henderson said as they settled into chairs that had probably been purchased during the Carter administration. I'm afraid I'm rather old-fashioned when it comes to technology. Actually, I'm interested in understanding how student information is accessed and used, Echo Viper 13 replied smoothly. I understand there may have been some unusual inquiries recently about former students. Henderson's expression became wary. I'm not sure what you mean. Echo Viper 13 leaned forward slightly, employing the kind of subtle psychological pressure she had learned during her training. We've detected some anomalies in your student information systems that suggest someone has been accessing records inappropriately. I need to understand if anyone has approached you directly about specific students. After a moment of hesitation, Henderson nodded slowly. There was something unusual about 2 months ago. A woman called said she was doing a follow-up study on military recruitment outcomes. She was specifically interested in students who had enlisted in the Air Force during the past few years. Did she ask about anyone in particular? She had a list of names, students who had enlisted between 2021 and 2024. She wanted to know about their academic performance, their family backgrounds, any special programs they might have participated in. Henderson paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. I told her I couldn't share that kind of information without proper authorization, but she was very persuasive. She knew details about our programs that suggested she had some kind of official connection. Echo Viper 13 felt her pulse accelerate, but her voice remained calm and professional. Do you remember any of the specific names she asked about? A few. There was Jason Chen, who went into the Air Force after graduating with honors in mathematics, Maria Rodriguez, who had been in our computer science club, and Henderson hesitated again. Sarah Martinez. That was a name that surprised me, because Sarah had been such a quiet student. I wouldn't have expected military service to appeal to someone like her. What else did the caller want to know about Sarah specifically? She asked about Sarah's technical abilities, whether she had shown any special aptitude for computers or mathematics. She wanted to know about her family situation, her social connections, even her psychological profile from our counseling sessions. Henderson's discomfort was evident. I didn't provide any of that information, of course, but the questions were very specific. Echo Viper 13 conducted similar interviews throughout the day, talking to teachers, administrators, and support staff who had known Sarah Martinez. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Someone had been conducting a systematic investigation of her background, using sophisticated social engineering techniques to extract information from people who didn't realize they were being manipulated. The investigator had identified herself by different names to different people, but the description was consistent. A woman in her late 20s or early 30s, professionally dressed with an authoritative manner and detailed knowledge of military recruitment processes. She had approached Sarah's mathematics teacher, her computer science instructor, even the librarian who had helped her find advanced programming books. More concerning was the evidence that the investigation hadn't been limited to phone calls and interviews, and someone had broken into the school building twice in recent months, accessing files and computer systems during weekend hours when the building was supposedly secure. The intrusions had been so professionally executed that they hadn't been detected until Echo Viper 13's systematic security assessment revealed traces of unauthorized access. By evening, Echo Viper 13 had compiled enough information to begin constructing a profile of her investigator. The woman was clearly someone with extensive training in intelligence gathering and social engineering, someone who understood operational security and surveillance techniques. But more importantly, she knew enough about the Phase 2 program to understand what kind of background would be significant in identifying potential operatives. Echo Viper 13 returned to her hotel room and established a secure communication link with Colonel Mitchell. The conversation that followed confirmed her worst fears and revealed new dimensions to the threat they were facing. "We've identified our missing operative," Mitchell informed her without preamble. Echo Viper 09. Real name Catherine Walsh. She completed Phase 2 training 18 months before you did. Her last confirmed contact was 7 weeks ago, just before the security breach at the training facility. What was her operational status? Deep cover assignment in Eastern Europe, investigating arms trafficking networks with cyber warfare connections. She was supposed to check in monthly, but we haven't heard from her since March. We initially thought she might have been compromised by hostile forces, but now we're wondering if she's gone rogue. Echo Viper 13 processed this information, connecting it to what she had learned in Cedar Falls. The timeline matches the beginning of the investigation into my background. If Echo Viper 09 has turned, she would know exactly what kind of information to look for and how to find it. There's more, Mitchell continued. We've discovered that someone has been accessing classified databases using Echo Viper 09's credentials. They've been gathering information about all Phase 2 operatives, their real identities, their operational histories, and their personal backgrounds. We think she's building a comprehensive intelligence package. For what purpose? That's what we need to find out. The possibilities range from selling the information to hostile foreign intelligence services to planning some kind of direct action against the program and its operatives. Either way, she represents an existential threat to everything we've built. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering operational protocols and contingency plans. When it concluded, Echo Viper 13 found herself facing a challenge unlike anything she had encountered in her professional career. She wasn't just hunting an enemy. She was hunting someone who had been trained by the same instructors, who had learned the same techniques, who understood her capabilities because they shared similar capabilities. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. Echo Viper 13 was conducting a routine assessment of the school district's firewall logs when she detected an active intrusion attempt. Someone was trying to penetrate the network in real time, using sophisticated techniques that suggested professional-level expertise. Rather than blocking the intrusion, Echo Viper 13 decided to monitor it, hoping to gather intelligence about the attacker's methods and objectives. What she discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The intruder was using attack vectors and exploitation techniques that were taught exclusively in Phase 2 training. The intrusion was being conducted by Echo Viper 09. Echo Viper 13 made a decision that violated every operational security protocol she had ever learned. Instead of reporting the contact immediately, she decided to engage directly with her rogue colleague. Using techniques that existed in the gray area between cybersecurity and cyber warfare, she established a secure communication channel and sent a simple message: "I know who you are." The response came within minutes. "Then you know why I'm here." What followed was a digital conversation that took place across encrypted channels, hidden from conventional surveillance but visible to anyone with the specialized skills of a Phase 2 operative. Echo Viper 09 revealed that her investigation of the program wasn't motivated by foreign influence or financial gain, but by something far more personal and complex. "They turned us into weapons," Echo Viper 09 wrote. "They took kids with exceptional abilities and transformed them into tools for missions that we never agreed to support. They made us disappear from our own lives, cut us off from everyone we cared about, and convinced us that we were serving some greater good." "We are serving a greater good," Echo Viper 13 responded. "The missions we conduct prevent terrorism, stop cyber warfare, protect innocent people. Do they? Or do we just do whatever serves the interests of people who view us as expendable assets? How many of our operations have been about protecting American interests versus protecting the careers and budgets of our handlers?" The conversation continued for hours, covering philosophical questions about the nature of their work, the morality of their methods, and the personal cost of their transformation from ordinary individuals into classified weapons. Echo Viper 09 revealed that her investigation wasn't intended to expose the program to hostile forces, but to gather evidence of misconduct and abuse that she believed had occurred during their training and deployment. "I want to give people like us a choice," she explained. "A chance to understand what they're really signing up for, what they'll be required to do, and what they'll lose in the process. The program recruits vulnerable kids with exceptional abilities and transforms them into something that serves the system rather than their own interests." "And what exactly do you plan to do with the information you're gathering?" "I'm going to expose it, not to foreign intelligence services but to congressional oversight committees and investigative journalists who can force accountability. People have a right to know that the government is recruiting children and turning them into cyber warriors without their informed consent." Echo Viper 13 realized that she was facing a dilemma that her training had never prepared her for. Echo Viper 09 wasn't a traitor in the conventional sense. She was someone who had reached different conclusions about the morality and legitimacy of their shared profession. Her actions were motivated by principles rather than greed or ideology, which made her both more dangerous and more sympathetic than a traditional enemy. "You're putting all of us at risk," Echo Viper 13 pointed out. "If you expose the program, you'll destroy the lives of everyone who has ever been part of it. We won't be able to return to our original identities, but we won't be able to continue our current lives either. Maybe that's a price worth paying, to prevent the program from destroying more lives in the future." The conversation ended without resolution, but with an agreement to continue their dialogue. Echo Viper 09 had given Echo Viper 13 48 hours to consider her position and decide whether she would help expose the program or continue to protect it. As Echo Viper 13 sat in her hotel room that night, she found herself questioning assumptions she had never examined before. Had she been manipulated during her recruitment? Had her desperate desire to escape her circumstances in Cedar Falls made her vulnerable to a program that promised transformation, but delivered something closer to exploitation? She thought about the girl who had been invisible in her high school cafeteria, who had suffered casual cruelty and systematic dismissal. That girl had wanted to matter, to use her abilities for something important. to escape the limitations that others had placed on her. The program had given her all of those things, but at what cost? Echo Viper 13 realized that tomorrow she would have to make a choice that would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone who had ever been part of the Phase 2 program. She could protect the system that had created her, or she could join the effort to expose and reform it. Either way, the girl they had once called useless was about to make a decision that would reshape the secret world of cyber warfare forever. The decision came to Echo Viper 13 in the most unexpected place: the Cedar Falls Public Library, where Sarah Martinez had once spent countless hours reading programming books and dreaming of escape. She had returned there under the pretense of examining their network security, but found herself drawn to the same corner table where she had once hidden from the world that didn't understand her. As she sat in that familiar space, surrounded by the musty smell of old books and the quiet whispers of students doing homework, Echo Viper 13 realized that her transformation hadn't just changed who she was, it had changed how she saw the world. The invisible girl who had once sought refuge in this library had been genuinely grateful for any opportunity to use her abilities for something meaningful. But the operative she had become understood manipulation, exploitation, and the complex ways that good intentions could be corrupted by institutional power. Her secure communication device chimed softly, indicating a message from Colonel Mitchell. The text was brief but urgent. Situation escalating. Echo Viper 09 has made contact with Congressional Oversight Committee. Need immediate extraction and debriefing. Echo Viper 13 stared at the message for a long moment, understanding that this was the moment when she had to choose between two versions of loyalty. Loyalty to the program that had created her, or loyalty to the principles that had motivated her original desire to serve. The choice would define not just her future, but her understanding of who she had become during her years as a classified weapon. Instead of responding to Mitchell's message, she initiated a secure connection with Echo Viper 09. "I've made my decision," she typed. "But I want to do this right. If we're going to expose the program, we need to do it in a way that protects the operatives who never asked to be put in this position." "I'm listening," came the immediate response. "Meet me tonight, Cedar Falls Park, near the memorial statue. Come alone, and we'll figure out how to give people the choice that we never had." The hours between that message and the scheduled meeting were among the longest in Echo Viper 13's professional career. She spent the time reviewing every classified operation she had conducted, every mission that had been justified as serving national security interests, every decision that had been made for her by people who viewed her as a tool rather than a person with agency and rights. The pattern she discovered was disturbing but not surprising. Many of the missions had indeed served legitimate security interests, preventing genuine threats and protecting innocent people. But others had been conducted to serve bureaucratic goals, to gather intelligence that supported predetermined policy positions, or to eliminate threats to the program itself rather than threats to national security. She had been used, not just as a weapon against America's enemies, but as an instrument for protecting the institutional interests of people who had never risked anything themselves. The girl who had been grateful for any opportunity to matter had been transformed into someone whose worth was measured entirely by her usefulness to a system that would discard her the moment she became inconvenient. Echo Viper 13 arrived at Cedar Falls Park 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, using skills learned during years of operational training to conduct a thorough surveillance sweep of the area. The park was empty except for a few teenagers on the basketball court and an elderly man walking his dog along the jogging trail. More importantly, there were no signs of government surveillance or hostile observation. She positioned herself near the memorial statue, a modest granite monument dedicated to local residents who had died in various American wars. As she read the names carved into the stone, Echo Viper 13 reflected on the irony that her own war had been fought in cyberspace against enemies who would never know her name, for objectives that had often been decided by people who had never faced real danger themselves. Echo Viper 09 appeared exactly at the scheduled time, approaching from the direction of the parking lot with the casual confidence of someone who had conducted countless clandestine meetings. She looked nothing like the dangerous rogue operative that Colonel Mitchell had described, a woman in her early 30s, dressed in civilian clothes that could have belonged to any professional visiting a small town for business purposes. But Echo Viper 13's trained eye caught details that revealed her true nature. The way she moved suggested extensive physical conditioning. Her scan of the surrounding area was systematic and professional, and her positioning allowed for multiple escape routes while maintaining visual control of the meeting space. "You look different than I expected," Echo Viper 09 said as she approached. "When I was researching your background, I kept thinking about the girl in those high school photos. Quiet, invisible, unremarkable. They really did transform you into something else entirely. The same way they transformed you," Echo Viper 13 replied. "The question is whether that transformation was worth what we lost in the process." They talked for 2 hours, sharing experiences and perspectives that could only be understood by someone who had undergone similar training and faced similar challenges. Echo Viper 09 revealed details about her investigation that went far beyond what she had previously disclosed. Evidence of psychological manipulation during recruitment, documentation of missions that had violated international law, and testimony from former operatives who had been discarded when they became inconvenient to the program. "The most disturbing thing isn't what they made us do," Echo Viper 09 explained. "It's how they convinced us that we wanted to do it. They identified kids who were vulnerable, isolated, desperate to prove themselves, and they crafted recruitment approaches that made us feel like we were making free choices when we were actually being manipulated." Echo Viper 13 nodded, remembering her own recruitment experience and the way Captain Rodriguez had seemed to offer her exactly what she had needed most at that moment in her life. "But some of the work is legitimate," she pointed out. "Some of the missions have genuinely protected people and prevented real threats. That's what makes it so insidious. They wrap the exploitation in enough legitimate purpose to make it seem justified. But ask yourself this. If they had told you during recruitment that you would spend your career conducting operations that serve bureaucratic interests as often as national security interests, would you have enlisted?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered because they both knew the response. "What exactly are you proposing?" Echo Viper 13 asked finally. Echo Viper 09 outlined a plan that was both elegant and devastating in its implications. Rather than exposing the program through media leaks or congressional testimony that could be dismissed or suppressed, she wanted to create a systematic documentation of every questionable operation, every instance of psychological manipulation, every case where operatives had been put at risk for non-essential missions. "We give current and future operatives the information they need to make informed decisions about their participation," she explained. "We document the reality of what the program actually involves, not the sanitized version they present during recruitment. And we create accountability mechanisms that prevent the worst abuses while preserving the legitimate national security functions. It would require the cooperation of other operatives, careful documentation of classified information, and the kind of coordinated effort that could take years to complete. But it would also create the possibility of reforming the program rather than simply destroying it, protecting current operatives while preventing future exploitation. And if the program decides we're too dangerous to leave alive?" Echo Viper 13 asked. "Then we make sure enough documentation is already in place that our deaths would confirm everything we're alleging. Dead whistleblowers are often more credible than living ones." Echo Viper 13 made her final decision that night, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of choosing between protecting the program and exposing it, she chose a third option, transforming it from within. Over the following months, she maintained her cover as Dr. Alexandra Stevens, while secretly documenting every aspect of her operational history and current assignment. She established contact with other Phase 2 operatives, not to recruit them for Echo Viper 09's cause, but to create a network of professionals who could advocate for reform while continuing to serve legitimate national security interests. The process was slow and dangerous, requiring her to operate under multiple layers of deception while maintaining the trust of handlers who would eliminate her if they discovered her activities. But Echo Viper 13 had advantages that made the risk manageable. She understood the system intimately because she had been created by it, and she had skills that allowed her to operate undetected within environments designed to prevent exactly what she was doing. The breakthrough came 8 months later, when Colonel Mitchell summoned her to Washington for a routine debriefing that turned into something much more significant. As she sat in the secure conference room where she had received so many mission assignments, Mitchell spread a collection of documents across the table that looked disturbingly familiar. "We know what you've been doing," he said quietly. "The documentation you've been creating, the contacts you've established with other operatives, the communication with Echo Viper 09. We know all of it. Echo Viper 13 felt the familiar calm that came with facing a crisis situation, but this time it was accompanied by something she hadn't expected: relief. The months of deception had been exhausting in ways that her most dangerous operational assignments had never been. "Are you going to eliminate me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the question. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex problem. "That was the recommendation from some quarters," he admitted finally. "But there are others who believe you might be right about the need for reform. People who have been uncomfortable with some of our methods, but didn't know how to address the problems without destroying the legitimate functions of the program." What followed was the most important conversation of Echo Viper 13's professional career, a 3-hour discussion about accountability, oversight, and the possibility of creating mechanisms that would preserve the program's national security functions while eliminating its potential for abuse. Mitchell revealed that her documentation had been more valuable than she had realized, providing concrete evidence of problems that senior leadership had suspected but been unable to quantify. The girl they called useless has become someone who might save this entire program from its own worst impulses, Mitchell said as their conversation concluded. That's either the most ironic outcome imaginable or the most predictable one. 6 months later, Echo Viper 13 received a new assignment that reflected the changes her efforts had helped bring about. She was appointed to a newly created oversight position, responsible for ensuring that future Phase 2 operatives received honest information about their roles and responsibilities, and that their missions served legitimate national security interests rather than bureaucratic convenience. It wasn't the career she had originally envisioned when she left Cedar Falls, but it was something more valuable: a chance to protect other vulnerable kids from the exploitation she had experienced while preserving their opportunity to use exceptional abilities in service of something meaningful. The woman who returned to Cedar Falls for a final visit looked nothing like either Sarah Martinez or Dr. Alexandra Stevens. Echo Viper 13 had evolved into something new, someone who understood power and how to use it responsibly, someone who could navigate complex systems while maintaining her own moral center, someone who had learned to be visible when it mattered while remaining invisible when it served her purposes. As she stood in the high school cafeteria where her transformation had begun, Echo Viper 13 reflected on the journey that had taken her from invisible victim to classified weapon to institutional reformer. Derek Morrison was gone, graduated and working at his father's struggling car dealership, unaware that the girl he had once tormented had become someone whose decisions affected national security. But more importantly, other kids like Sarah Martinez would now have the choice that she had been denied: the opportunity to understand what they were committing to before they committed to it, and the protection of oversight mechanisms that would ensure their abilities were used for purposes they could believe in. The girl they had called useless had become someone who mattered in ways her tormentors could never have imagined. But perhaps more significantly, she had become someone who ensured that other invisible kids would have better choices than she had been given. Colonel Mitchell's words echoed in her mind as she drove away from Cedar Falls for what she knew would be the last time. Echo Viper 13, your mission is to make sure that we never again transform vulnerable kids into weapons without their informed consent. Use whatever methods you consider appropriate. The most dangerous operative in the program had become its conscience, and the invisible girl had found a way to matter that even her exceptional imagination had never contemplated. She had saved not just the program, but the principles that had motivated her original desire to serve, ensuring that future operatives would have the choice that she had never been given. It was, perhaps, the most important mission of her career, giving other people the power to choose who they would become, rather than simply accepting who others decided they should be. The girl they had called useless had become someone who ensured that no one else would ever be dismissed as easily as she had been.